Doing philosophy is like watching a magician perform on the stage.
Yeah, hello to everyone. My name is Alex Grishkov, and I'm the head of the project on classical authors in ethical theory. We started at HEC University here in Moscow. And this is our third meeting in the series of discussion on philosophical ethics. Our guest today is Thomas Scanlon, a philosopher, Alford professor of natural religion, moral philosophy, and civil polity at Harvard University. And Professor Scanlon is one of the most influential philosophers of our time, the author of the famous books such as What We Owe to Each Other and Being Realistic About Reasons. And what is sincerely important to me, Professor Scanlon is one of the most persuasive proponents of the contractual theory in ethics, the theory which is, I believe, as well as some of my colleagues, is drastically underrepresented in contemporary Russian philosophy and social thought. Professor Scanlon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Great. So we have 3 question pools we'd like to discuss with you today. First on the interrelation between one's personality and one's moral theory. Second, on the role of moral intuition and intuitive thinking. And finally, on the pluralism of morality and moral reasoning. And after that, we will have a short and quick round of questions. If you are ready, I'm glad to give floor to Lisa Karpova for the first questions.
Oh yeah, thank you and hello. Thank you for the participation. And the first block of the question, as Alexey Alexandrovich also mentioned, is connected with the topic of distinction between one's personality and one's moral theory. And so in the context, in the text that we're discussing today, you mentioned a very interesting remark about contractualism and utilitarianism made by Derek Parfit. And as he said to you, this paper, its early stages looked more like an expression of your personal thought, of your personality, than a work in moral theory, pointing out that the task of separating one from another. However, a different position can be established, one that draws on the notion of philosophy as a way of life. For example, is proposed by authors like Pierre Hadot and Michel Foucault, and also on the basic theoretical principles of virtue ethics. And its proponents would state that moral philosophy should constitute exactly the attempt to elaborate and defend one's personal views on morality by means of moral argument, thereby merging one's life and one's philosophical work. And this position presupposes that our moral character can be molded and sustained mostly by practicing certain virtues and moral principles which we deem right. And of course, we already got your answer, but what do you think about this virtue-based position, which seems to be an alternative to Parfit's Parfit's one? And in your view, ultimately, should one base one's moral philosophy on one's personality and one's moral character and moral virtues as well, which are formed and sustained in the course of one's life? And if not, where is the boundary that separates these two spheres of personal life and philosophy?
Well, thank you for this question. I'll separate my answer into a couple of parts. One has to do with the relation between one's personality and one's ethics and how one proceeds on that basis. And then the third part would be about virtue ethics, which I'm more skeptical about. Okay, so, and you know, I guess although I'm not a follower of Michel Foucault, I do think there's a lot of an inescapable connection between one's life and one's philosophy. philosophy consists in the investigation of things that are puzzling, and what seems puzzling to you depends on what you're like, and things seem puzzling perhaps because you're inclined to think one thing, but you're inclined to think something else that's inconsistent with that. So how am I going to deal with this conflict, right? So here I agree with Aristotle in the passage I mentioned from book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, that is, at the beginning of philosophy, you have to start with what's known to you, that is, what seems right to you, right? And that's going to be shaped by your personality and your experience and so on. Both what's puzzling and what your attention is directed to, all of that is heavily dependent on what you're like. But I would slightly take exception to the idea that what we try to do is to elaborate and defend this. What we want to do is to interrogate it, to decide, should I really believe that, right? And that's what I think the so-called method of reflective equilibrium, which was the name given by my teacher and friend, John Rawls, I think is inescapable. It's open to the charge that it's just a matter of justifying what you already thought. But I see it differently. I see it as you start with what you already thought, and then you ask, should I really think that, right? So that's what I think. So just as an example, I often say to my students that doing philosophy is like watching a magician perform on the stage and trying to figure out where the trick was performed, right? The difference is that when you're doing philosophy, you are simultaneously the magician and the person who is watching. So how does a stage magician perform his tricks? The stage magician does something distracting with his right hand, while his left hand takes the handkerchief out of the hat and puts it into his pocket, or takes the rabbit out of his pocket and puts it into the hat, or whatever, right? So you don't notice what the left hand is doing because your attention is distracted by the right hand, right? Philosophy. So what do? Well, you have to just watch the trick very, very carefully and not be so distracted by the right hand that you don't see what the left hand is doing. So in philosophy, we think something, as it were, the right hand of the mind focuses on some seemingly important aspect of the problem. And we're focused so much on that we don't notice that we've drawn a conclusion from that without noticing that there was something else going on that was relevant and we didn't take it into account, right? So what you do is to go over the steps of the argument many, many times and try to notice what was left out. There was if there's a conflict, I seem to be led to this conclusion that doesn't seem right, even though the beginning seemed right. So I must have made a mistake somewhere along the way. And I keep running the tape over and over again until I see, that's where I missed it. So that's a very old-fashioned, in contemporary terms, an old-fashioned conception of philosophy. It's very typical of the kind of Oxford philosophy of the 1950s, which is not surprising since the 1950s was when I was introduced into philosophy. And at that time, Oxford philosophy was very, very influential in the United States and in the department where I studied. The Indian journalist Ved Mehta, you probably never heard of him, but he was a blind Indian journalist who was a very good writer. He wrote for the New Yorker, who wrote a book about philosophy of Oxford philosophy of the 1950s, which was called The Fly and the Fly Bottle. A fly bottle was a kind of thing that you used to trap flies. It has sugar water in the bottom, and the flies go in and they can't figure how to get out, right? And so somebody of that era, it might have been Wittgenstein, said that what philosophy does is to try to show us how to escape from the fly bottle that we have created in our mind. So that's very much like this. I should say Ved Mehta wasn't a philosopher. He was mostly a memoirist. He just recently died this year. You can read an obituary of him. He went blind when he was very young, and he was had a quite remarkable career in New York. His he also made an important contribution to philosophy. He was once walking down the street in New York with Derek Parfit when Derek had just graduated from high school and was on a fellowship in America, and he had a summer job as an intern at the New Yorker magazine, which was a famous magazine, right? And they were walking down the street, and Derek, typical of Derek, was so engrossed in the conversation that he was about to step out in front of a bus, and he would have been killed. But Vedmeda, who was blind, but operated on the basis of what he could hear, he heard the bus coming and he grabbed Derek and pulled him back. So that's Vedmeda's contribution. He changed the course. He changed the course of philosophy by saving Derek Parfit's life. But anyway, you didn't need to that digression, I'm sorry. But I thought you would find this story amusing. So here's an example. So you've probably read Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, or many of you have, right? So in chapter 8 of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Nozick is considering objections to his view, right? And one objection, there's a section called having a right to what affects you. And he imagines somebody might object that in a society that was governed by his Lockean principles, some people would lack control over their lives because other people would own all the water or the food or something, and they would have to work for them, and they wouldn't have any choice. So Nozick presents this counterexample of this problem, and so he says, well, let's look at this. Do people actually have a right to have a say over what affects them? And he says, no, they don't. I'll show you by one example. So what affects you more than who you marry? But if the person you want to marry marries somebody else, your life is affected very badly. So does that mean that you have a right to tell this woman that she can't marry this other person? Clearly you don't. So people don't have a right to have a say over what affects them, and they dismisses the example, right? Well, that's a case of a magic trick, I think, where Nozick wasn't trying to trick us, but he was in a way tricking himself, because the person who raised the objector didn't say that people have a right to have a say over what affects them. They just said it's an objection. It can be an objection to a system of rights if it forces some people to be completely under the control of other people. The word right was not used, right? But Nozick reformulates the objection in terms of a supposed right to have a say over what affects you, then refutes that and then goes on, right? So that's an example. I don't mean to say this as a criticism of Bob Nozick. He was a friend of mine, and I think a very brilliant man. But I think that's an example of a kind of sleight of an unintentional sleight of hand. And I think that I've done this many times, and we all in philosophy, we all do it to ourselves. So this is an example of how philosophy is trying to overcome our initial reactions to things, right? It has to start there, but what we try to figure out whether we should really believe that or not. So that's probably more time answering that question than you wanted. But anyway, with several digressions about Vedmeda and Nozick, one thing that my students always say about me that, at any time I'm teaching a class, I spend a lot of the time telling stories. So there's an example. You can see what it's like to be in a class of mine. So I agree with you and with Derek that where we start from has to do with our personality. I don't understand, maybe you can explain this to me, but I don't see this as being a connection to virtue ethics. Virtue ethics means that where we wind up should be not with principles about what we ought to do, but with the idea that what you ought to do is determined by what a good person would do, right? And I think there's a lot that's right about Aristotle's philosophy, but I think that shifting the question to what would a good person do, as it were, kind of distracts us from the question of, well, what would I do if I were a good person, right? That's the question I want an answer to. So I'm a little bit skeptical about virtue ethics, although I can see its appeal. Okay, that's my attempt to answer your question, Elisabetta. I hope that got part of it.
Yeah, if I may maybe make a little specification on this question.
Sure, of course.
Yeah, so I mean that maybe it is a little bit more broader questions, not exactly about the virtue ethics, but about virtue theory and its applications in quite recent works like Lorraine Dustin and Peter Gallison Objectivity. So I mean, when you were talking about method of reflective equilibrium, which is important to you, I believe that we can see it as a kind of, you know, something connected with the epistemic virtue of all-rounded critical thinking or logical consistency. I mean, that for me, for example, so I understand that virtue ethics itself is not about the question of justification. But right. I believe that contractual theory could be coupled with virtue ethics, with virtue theory, in this way that, for example, the contractual theory can give us, to use Aristotelian language, can give us good understanding of the goals of our communal practices. But the way how we will achieve these goals could be reasonably connected with the virtues, not moral virtues, but epistemic virtues as well. And I mean, this will merge these two questions, like the sphere of epistemology and the sphere of ethics. In this way, do you think that it could be useful, maybe not on the basic level of the question of justification, but on this question of the first ordered moral judgments? And I believe that these two theories could be coupled in quite interesting ways.
Got it. Okay, I'm not certain that I've grasped the question, Alex. You can ask again, but here are two tries, right? Certainly, if I think that the method of reflective equilibrium is the best way to go about this, then I think that it's an epistemic virtue to think that way, right? So I agree about that. I don't think that I get to the I don't think I arrive at or defend or whatever the method of reflective equilibrium by reflecting on the question of epistemic virtue. But conclusions about epistemic virtue are definitely going to follow downstream. I get to the method of reflective equilibrium by thinking, well, how else could I decide? What, you know, if it's not the reflective equilibrium, where am I getting this, right? So that's a kind of that's one answer. The other answer is I do think that I understand the appeal of virtue ethics in a couple of ways, although I'm not sure that this is all of what makes it appealing to its followers. But the two that I mentioned are this. One, virtue ethics is often contrasted with an idea that what ethics is supposed to do is to give us principles from which we can simply read off the right answer about what to do. And so virtue ethics says, no, it's always going to take judgment to apply the principle. And so there's a role for judgment that a purely principle-based theory would leave out. And I totally agree with that, right? I think what contractualism does is to try to identify the elements that we're thinking about. But when we decide whether it would be reasonable to reject something, it requires a judgment. There's no principle about that. And so I think that if what we mean is that we can't eliminate the element of judgment, then I'm totally on the Aristotelian side, right? Another way in which I think that my view is consistent with or whatever, or tries to make go along with a virtue-based view is that one of the things that virtue ethics may try to do is to give a picture of how thinking ethically fits into having the kind of life people should want to have, right? It's part of being, not simply part of being a morally good person, but a part of having the kind of best kind of life that you could have. And it's because it has a fit between those that it's superior to, let's say, principle-based ethics that leaves it completely open, but it's going to cost me a lot to go along with those principles. So what's that got to do with my life, right? And so I think contractualism tries to take a step in the direction of virtue ethics at that point. In my early part of chapter 4 of What We Owe to Each Other, I contrast a formal versus a substantive answer to the question why we should care about morality, right? And a formal answer has to be something like Kant's categorical imperative. That is, it's built into the structure of practical reasoning or something like that. And I find that rather implausible. So I think the idea of living with other people on a basis of cooperation that they could have reason to accept, that's a substantive thing. And I just try to say, look, isn't that a way you would want to live? So contractualism, the very beginning of contractualism, this is probably one of the things that Derek Parfit had in mind when he said that it was reflective of my personality. I found contractualism appealing because it has what seems to me a plausible answer to the question why we should care about morality, because thinking about what to do in the way that contractualism described fits with a kind of communal living that I think it would be a mistake not to see the advantages of. So those are two ways: the role for judgment and the need to integrate moral thinking with the kind of life we would want to live. In those two ways, I think I am on the same side of the street as virtue ethics.
Great, thank you. So, and I mean, we discussed it a lot in our group, and we think it as well, as a persuasive intuition. That's why yeah. So then I will give the floor to Sanjar Akayev for the further blocks of the questions.
Yeah, thank you. So now we can move on to the second set of questions, which is about the role of moral intuition and intuitive thinking in moral theory. And I have one preliminary remark. We, of course, understand that these questions are based on your extremely influential text, Contractualism and Utilitarianism, which we actually translated for our reader in ethical theory. We acknowledge that in What We Owe to Each Other, your position changed a little bit, or even more than a little bit. But we just wanted to reiterate some important themes and topics from this earlier text, because it is important for us. And I'll start with the first question. In Contractualism and Justification, your recent text, you pay considerable attention to the notion of moral intuition and intuitive thinking. For instance, as you point out, a certain type of moral argument can be drawn from our moral intuitions, one that can be used to discover the first principles in moral philosophy, and by employing the method of reflective equilibrium. Moreover, as you write, intuitive normative thinking is inescapable in moral theory, and it should be used to reflect on our reasons for acceptance or rejection of a given moral principle. Building on these remarks, I wanted to ask whether, in your view, moral intuition is somehow connected to our innate desire to find and agree on moral principles, a desire that played an important role in your early work, such as Contractualism and Utilitarianism. Can this desire be considered an expression or a subpart of our moral intuition, or vice versa? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. There's much to say about this. Let me see. I mean, one way to think about the paper on contractualism and justification is to ask, who is Scanlon fighting with, or who's he worried about responding to, right? And so you wouldn't be far wrong if you identified my former colleague Frances Cam as the main interlocutor, right? I don't know if you've read any of Frances Cam's work, but she's a person who is a virtuoso of the intuitive method. I mean, she focuses on detailed examination of, well, exactly why do we think that? Maybe we're overlooking these distinctions. I mean, she's amazingly good at that, as a result of which her articles are almost unreadable because there are so many distinctions, you can't keep them all in your head at the same time. But she's really brilliant and wonderful. I'll tell another story having to do with her and David Gautier a little later on when we get to David Gautier. So one thing I might say, comparing myself to Francis, what role is moral intuition playing? Well, one role it's playing is contractualism as a theory wouldn't get off the ground, in my thought, if it didn't seem to provide, the right answers in a significant number of cases, right? So the claim to contractualism to be identifying what Aristotle called the first principles of moral right and wrong rests in part upon its being compatible with my substantive, at least some of the most obvious fixed points in the moral outlook that I started with. So that's the first direction of argument that Aristotle describes. But I think that so that's one role that intuition has. But I think that once one has discovered, settled on some first principles, the principles provide you with a way of thinking about which questions how you want to answer various questions, which is a kind of alternative to direct reliance on intuition in every case. So let me give an example about discussions of rights. Right. So suppose there's a question about whether a certain action would violate someone's right to privacy. We have the questions about the internet, right? Whether certain kind of constraints on the internet violate people's right to privacy, or whether they violate freedom of expression on the other hand. And how do you answer those questions? Well, one way would be to try to come up with, directly apply the method of reflective equilibrium, try to find the fixed points in our thinking and see, does this really count as an act of expression or not? Or is this really privacy, or things like that? And so I take my view, contractualism, and my view more generally, to provide an alternative to that way of thinking, which may come out at the same place at the end, but it's a sort of alternative. That is, if I ask whether something violates the right to privacy, let's say, I want to say, well, why do we think there is a right to privacy? We think there is a right to privacy because we think that people have certain reasons to want to keep parts of their lives away from the scrutiny of others, right? And if there were no limits on what other people could do, our lives would be too open to observation by other people, right? Now, exactly what parts of our lives we need to be able to shield, that's going to depend on what kind of society we live in, right? Whether we have financial records, whether, what counts as embarrassing, there's a social background there. But given a social background, we have reasons. So the question of devising a right to privacy is devising a system of limits on people's ability to observe me, which give me enough space to live my life on my own, but don't impinge unacceptably on what other people can do, right? I can't require everybody else to go around with blindfolds on so that they don't see me, right? That would be too restrictive of them. So you can see the contractualist's formula here. I want to find principles that would be reasonable for me to reject. If they would intrude too much into my privacy, I would object to them, and it would be reasonable to object to them if those principles wouldn't impose too much of a burden on other people. So this is what I call a reductive way of thinking about what rights we have. I start by thinking about what rights we have, and I go behind the rights and I look at the particular interests that those rights have to protect. And I think about, do those rights need to be adjusted or changed in order to be protecting those rights in the right way? Now, in being reductive in that sense, this way of thinking about rights is very much like what has been called rule utilitarianism, right? Utilitarian, John Stuart Mill, in the final chapter of his famous book, Utilitarianism, offers a similarly reductive account of rights. There are things that people need to have protection of. Why do they need to have the protection? Well, giving them that protection promotes the general utility, right? So there's a kind of consequentialist discussion of why should you have these rights? Well, you have them because they'll promote more happiness, and it's a good thing to have more happiness, right? So my view, in contrast to the intuitive way of thinking about rights, it's a reductive way, but in that way, it's like rule utilitarianism. But it's different in taking the basic, the elements that you reduce it to be facts about individuals' reasons, rather than facts about what's good to have happen in the world. So that's why, as I said in Contractualism and Justification, why John Rawls was correct when I first proposed this to me, and he said, "That seems right, Tim, but I don't see why you call it utilitarian, why you call it consequentialist," right? It took me a long time to figure that out. So I'm offering as an alternative to a purely intuitive method, a method that's reductive but not consequentialist, because what it reduces it to are facts about my reasons and your reasons, rather than facts about what it would be good to have the world be like. Okay, so I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's the answer that I prepared in my sleep last night. So you can follow up.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was exactly what we wanted to know, at least in my opinion. And it is now more clear than it was before. So thank you. And to continue with this idea of an innate desire, which is
yes, I got
again,
away from that. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead, and I will answer that. I will answer that part of your question next. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, which is, as I will reiterate, connected to your earlier work than your recent work. So unlike David Gautier's famous theory of contractualism, which tends to focus on rationality as a core cause of agreement between moral actors, contractualist theory gives more weight to the alternative idea, namely that moral agreement depends heavily on people's desire to find moral principles that no one would reject, at least reasonably. Would you say that there is indeed a considerable discrepancy between Gautier's rationalist premises and your premise of an innate desire for the agreement?
Yes, I would say there's a fundamental difference. The thing I didn't say in response to your first question is, although I think I would put it now in terms of a reason rather than a desire, I think we have a reason to want to live with others on grounds that we could justify to them. I don't think that's a moral intuition, because that's something that I appeal to in order to explain why we should be governed by morality. So it's not a moral requirement that we allow ourselves to be governed by morality. That would be circular to try to explain that. Right? Okay, but Gautier also was very concerned to explain why people should accept principles that capture at least a certain amount of the content of what we ordinarily call morality. But he thinks that in order to provide an explanation of what reasons people have, in order to avoid circularity, we can't appeal to moral intuitions. We have to appeal to what would advance their interests, or what would maximize their utility, or their utility is just defined by their desires, whatever their desires might be. So he takes that, as it were, ground of self-interested rationality as being the basis on which justification has to rest, right? And I think that both, I think that, you know, people have reason. We do have to base a justification for morality on claims about what reasons people have, but people have reasons other than advancing their interests, whatever those interests happen to be. And so my idea of reasons to want to live with people under mutually justifiable principles is an alternative to Gautier's framework. So I'll tell you two stories about Gautier now. He's a friend of mine. I'm speaking of him in the past tense. I don't know whether he's still alive. He retired from University of Pittsburgh in the early 2000s, I guess. But unlike me, I've been retired for 5 years now. But gone on working pretty much in the same way. Whereas when David retired, he went back to Canada where he was from, and he didn't do any more philosophy. He didn't write anymore. He didn't go to conferences. So I have no idea whether he's still alive, but he is or was, I think he's probably still alive, a friend of mine. He was a commentator on a session at the American Philosophical Association on my book, What We Owe to Each Other, when it first came out. It was called an Author Meets Critics session, and David was one of the critics. And he started off by saying, everything in this book is mistaken. Even the title is false. We don't owe anybody anything. So that's, and I said, David, even you don't believe that, because your morals by agreement prescribes that we owe it to people to do certain things to them. It's just a very limited set. Anyway, but he liked to exaggerate, right? And so he kind of stamped his foot and said, we don't owe anybody anything. So what he meant was that the starting point of morality has to be entirely what's in our self-interest. And insofar as we owe anything to anybody, it has to be because taking ourselves to owe that would benefit us, right? That's the only way we could justify that. That's his idea. Now, second, having to do with moral intuitions. For 25 years or something like that, I was a participant in a wonderful discussion group, which involved just as, I learned more from this than from anything else in my life. Had a lot of really great people, including Tom Nagel, and in the early days, John Rawls and Bob Nozick, and lots of people, including David Gautier, in the 1990s, and Francis Cam and Judy Thompson. And so intuitive moral argument was the sort of bread and butter of this group. And at one, I remember certainly when we were talking about papers by Francis or Judy or Tom Nagel, we were really just in the realm of moral intuition. And at one point in discussion, David had said something, and Francis or Judy said, "But David, intuitively, doesn't that just seem wrong for a person to do that?" And David said, "I can't answer, because I don't have any moral intuitions. I don't know what a moral intuition is," he said, stamping his foot for kind of verbally. Now, I thought that's actually wasn't true, right? If you read his paper, it's a very good paper called Why Contractualism. I'm sorry I can't give you a definite reference to it, but you can find it. In that paper, he's struggling to, as it were, trim and modify his idea of rational self-interested justification so that the consequences aren't completely morally outrageous, right? He said, well, if we took certain things seriously, then the system would be unstable. So it really wouldn't be in our, but I think he's using the idea of stability as a way of fending off conclusions that even he thinks are morally outrageous. So I think that contrary to what David maintained in these moments of excess, I think even he had moral intuitions, but he did think that we shouldn't rely on them. That wasn't what moral philosophy was about. Moral philosophy was about figuring out how a system involving moral conclusions could really be justified, and that meant really justified by appeal only to the reasons people have based on their subjective ends, whatever those happen to be. Now, I may have not answered your question because I'm telling my stories rather than answering your question, but I should stop there and let you follow up and ask what I should ask next.
I think it's sufficient, and it's all we wanted to know about your view on Gautier's theory. And I think for the sake of time, I shall move on to the third set of questions, which is about pluralism of morality and moral reasoning, and
Sure.
Topics that are connected to this area of moral theory. Or actually, I can still, I think, follow up the previous question, which I missed, sorry,
Yeah.
to this previous set of questions. It is the final one in the set of questions, and it goes as follows. From the standpoint of contractualism and utilitarianism, the desires we're talking about right now is one without which agreement itself is impossible. And people who lack this desire, who are not moved by it, are unable to participate in moral agreement as such. Thus, my second question about this desire concerns the possible limits of contractualist moral reasoning. Presumably, what happens when a person who is not moved either by desire or by reasons to find non-justifiable principles defies the contractualist moral agreement of other people, even though it is reasonable enough? Can this person be considered an immoral one or amoral one? And how should those who are led by the mentioned desire or reasons conduct themselves in regard to that person? Thank you.
Yeah, well, you're right that I suppose I would have to call such a person an amoral person. They didn't see any reason to care about morality. The question of how we should treat them, however, is still, by my lights, dictated by what morality requires. So it takes into account what principles it would be reasonable for them to reject, taking into account the interests of others and taking into account the reason that they have, even though they deny that they have such a reason, to be able to justify themselves to others. So I think the framework of morality still applies to them, even though they reject it. As to how we should treat them, well, probably if they're prepared to stab us in the back, we have to take precautions. But that doesn't mean that we're entitled to treat them badly. We can't stab them in the back. So I think they have pretty much the same rights as other people, but we do have to take precautions, I guess. Sorry, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think it does.
May I give a little bit follow-up question? So, I mean that in the case when we are talking about how we should treat people who are not concerned with the questions of morality, it is like we are concerned about it and we should find some way to include them in the sphere of morality. But if we will, consider the situation when, for example, the people who are not concerned with the questions of morality and who is not trying to, to include all people in this framework. But if these people, are responsible for the institutional design, which is in, for example, I don't know, in our country or in our society,
right,
what would be the, the reasons for them to care about what we can reasonably reject as our moral principles? Because I'm thinking about, so I mean that in the article Contractualism and Utilitarianism, you're trying to introduce this idea, this notion of trusteeship to, to make the sphere of morality more broad. But I was thinking about, what is going on when we are trying to talk about morality, but in different direction. That, for example, I believe that it is, that it is very persuasive, that we have this feeling that we don't want our actions or institutions, cannot be justified to some other people. But it is always question who these other people, who will consider as important others, because I think it is a big problem for the contractualist theory, the question of the sphere of morality. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay, good. That sharpens the question. Maybe the best way to start would be to contrast the way I understand this case of the amoral rational being with the case of, let's say, sentient but non-rational creatures like cows and mice and so on. It was in the latter case that I introduced the idea of trusteeship. I said, well, moral principles involve treating people in ways that they couldn't reasonably reject. And that involved the idea that they might be able to reasonably or not reasonably object presupposes that they have reasons. But some creatures are incapable of thinking in terms of reasons at all, then they're outside the framework of that. And I said, yes, they are outside that framework, not because they reject it, but simply because the whole idea of their having reasons doesn't really apply, right? And so that's where I said, well, you know, one way of dealing with that is to say, well, what you have left is basically a kind of utilitarianism. It's if they're in pain, it's a bad thing. And that's something we have reason to want to avoid. But that's a different kind of reason than the reason of treating them in ways that they couldn't reject. But if you don't like that, then you can think of treating them in ways that a trustee for them couldn't reasonably reject. And that would be a different way of trying to somehow bring sentient but non-rational creatures into the framework. But in response to the previous question, we're talking about rational human beings who are just basically morally deaf, or they don't see the point, right? They don't see any reason to do this. So they have reasons. So in asking how I should treat them, I can still ask, well, what principles, and not only do they have reasons, they also have reasons to be interested in justifying themselves to other people. They just don't care about those reasons, right? So I'm an objectivist. I'm a normative realist about statements about what reasons people have. This is one of the big transformation from from just contractualism and utilitarianism to what we owe to each other. But insofar as I'm a normative realist about what reasons people have, I want to say, well, these people do have reasons to accept these principles, so they couldn't reasonably reject these principles, even though they do reject them, right? So the same principles apply to them that apply to us. So that's a different kind of case than the case of the sentient but non-rational creatures like mice and sheep and dogs and so on. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, but I have less trouble saying what I think about how we should treat amoral human beings than about what to do about animals.
Thank you so much. Then Sanjar, please take the floor again.
Yeah, thank you. And
I
think I have one question, like a follow-up question to the question about Gautier and his theory. We had a lot of discussions in our group. We wanted to ask whether rationality. Yeah.
Sanjar, sorry. So the last thing we heard was like we had big discussions in our group, and after that, yeah. So start from.
Oh, sorry, it's my connection problems again. Yeah, we had a discussion about distinction between rationality and reasonableness, and I wanted to ask whether, in your view, Gautier's theory is closer to the idea of this rationality as a means of promoting one's interests or desires, and whether your theory is closer to this idea of reasonableness or reasonable rejection or acceptance of a principle, which is based on the reasons to accept or reject a principle. Like, is there a distinction, or are these two concepts quite different in your view?
That's a good question of clarification, Sanjar. I will. Part of the problem is that the words rational and rationality can mean a lot of different things. Early in the first chapter of What We Owe to Each Other, I try to distinguish these. So one idea of being rational is just being capable of thinking about reasons and being guided by them, right? Well, that's what it is to be a rational creature. That's what I was talking about in response to the previous question. Okay. Then there is the idea of being rational in the sense of not irrational. And by the way I understand that, to be irrational is to be able to understand reasons, but to act contrary to your own judgment about what reasons you have. So procrastination can be irrational, right? I know that I should go to the doctor to discuss this this growth that's growing on my head, but I don't want to do it because I'm afraid what's going to happen, right? So that would be irrational because I know that I judge myself to have a reason to do this, but I'm not doing it, right? Then there's a third way in which the idea of what rational is done, in which what it's rational to do is just what you have most reason to do, right? And I think that's a rather tendentious use of the term rational. So, for example, American economists often say, and this is getting close to David Gautier, right? That what it's rational for you to do is what's ever in your self-interest, right? It would be not rational for you not to do something that was in your self-interest or didn't maximize your income or whatever it is. And I think that's a claim about what people have reason to do, which is being, as it were, smuggled in as a claim about what it is to be rational. So I want to say, well, what you're saying is, well, this is what people have reason to do. And I say, okay, let's argue about that. I think people have reason to do other things. So rational people might act on a lot of other things, right? So Gautier uses the word rational in the way that was very traditional, in this third way of saying what it's rational to do is to do whatever is in your self-interest. And I want to say in response to that, well, people have reason to do a lot of what's in their self-interest, but that's not the only thing they have reason to care about. And so I broaden the idea of what we have reason to care about. So that's what I disagree. But that's not where the idea of reasonableness plays a role in my view. That's just a disagreement with him about the use of the term rational on the one hand, and a disagreement about what people actually have reason to do, right? That comes in at the level of justification for the moral principles I offer. Either people ought to care about morality because they have reason to care about whether they're living with others on terms that others couldn't reasonably reject. That's a claim about what they have reason to do. It's not the notion of reasonable doesn't come in there as a claim about why they should do it. It comes in there as a technical term. So I use reasonableness as a kind of technical term. I want to say, why do I say that, talk about principles that people couldn't reasonably reject? Well, there I want to use the idea of reasonableness in a sense that's not morally loaded. I think that here's an example. It was reasonable for you to think that I would connect on Zoom at 5:30 your time or 10:30 my time or whatever it was, right? And that's because you didn't know that, in fact, my child was sick and I wouldn't actually be able to be here, right? But given what you knew, it was reasonable for you to believe that, right? So what it was reasonable for you to believe depends upon a certain circumscribed set of considerations that were the ones that determine what you had reason to do, okay? So reasonableness is rationality, that's what we have reason to do relative to some contextually specified set of considerations, okay? So in the case of my contractualism, what it's reasonable for you to reject is what you have reason to reject, taking into account the reasons that other people have for rejecting competing principles, and also taking into account the reason that you have to find something that they could also accept, right? So the idea of reasonableness is not a morally loaded notion. It's one we use in epistemology, we use perfectly generally. It's just what you have reason to do relative to some specified set, right? But the content of contractualism, as opposed to the reasons for taking contractualism seriously, the content of contractualism is defined by what's reasonable relative to this specified set of considerations, namely the reasons, the personal reasons that you have based on how you would be affected as opposed to impersonal reasons, the reason you have to find principles that other people couldn't reasonably reject, and the personal reasons that other people have for rejecting principles. That's a very artificially specified set. So I want to say The idea of reasonableness relative to that is a way of characterizing the content of morality. So that's analogous to Rawls's original position, where he talks about the people in the original position choose principles based simply on certain factors. They're behind a veil of ignorance. They're doing all these kinds of things. And then there's a separate question: why should I take seriously the principles that people would accept behind the veil of ignorance, right? That's a separate question. So I don't use the idea of reasonableness to answer that question. I appeal to the idea of reasonableness in an analogous way to the way Rawls uses the veil of ignorance to define the set of considerations that go into determining which principles determine the content of morality. I don't know whether that clarifies things, but anyway, that's my best attempt.
Yeah, it's actually exactly what we needed to hear, because I think we kind of mixed up these two sides of the coin. I mean, moral arguments and a more broadly understood epistemological argument, which is, of course, which are of course different things. So I think it's very helpful. Thank you. And now I can move on to my final question, it is relatively speculative in my view, but still I think it is worth discussing, at least briefly. And it has to do with the pluralism of morality and moral reasoning. In Contractualism and Justification, you follow Derek Parfit in acknowledging that moral actions can be wrong in some non-contractualist sense. However, the new revised Contractualism presented in this paper seems to be moving away from this acknowledgement and focusing on supplementing contractualist justification with impersonal reasons for why the rejection of a given principle might be unreasonable. And as you put it, revised Contractualism seeks to take into account the number of individuals affected by a moral action without resorting to consequentialist aggregative principles. Thus, I wanted to ask whether you think it possible and/or necessary to actually use the notion of moral pluralism in our reasoning, thereby explaining the rightness and wrongness of action by turning to non-contractualist moral theories. If cases that call for such an approach do exist, are there any more or less universal criteria for their identification? Or should one decide and reason ad hoc, which means on the case basis? Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a tough question, has several parts. I am a kind of pluralist, certainly, about morality. That is to say, I think that morality, as the term is commonly used in English, covers a variety of different kinds of considerations. So in Contractualism and Utilitarianism, I offered Contractualism as a theory of what I called morality, right? But later, I keep thinking about this, I decided that there are a number of things that are objectionable, morally objectionable, which Contractualism doesn't explain. So I think it's morally objectionable. It can be a moral fault just to be very lazy and not put any effort into, say, developing the valuable talents that you have. I think that would be a moral fault. There's also a moral fault not to care for your children and sacrifice to take care of your children. But I don't think Contractualism provides a very good explanation of those. I mean, we have some reason to develop our talent because we owe it to other people to maybe develop drugs that would save them. But that's not the objection I had in mind. The idea, just aside from any benefit to other people, you're just failing to see something, you're failing to respond to a value that's there when you just sort of sleep all day, right? And similarly, taking care of your children, well, you could explain on contractualist grounds, you could try to explain why it's morally wrong not to take care of your children. You could say, well, here's a general principle, right? If you put someone in a position where they're not going to survive without your help, and then you don't provide your help, that's wrong. For example, if you take somebody out into the desert where they're going to need water, and then you don't take any precaution to bring them water, that the principle that allowed that would be one they could reasonably reject, right? So that's the way your children, right? You brought your children into the world knowing that very young children can't survive without their parents taking care of them. So they could reasonably reject a principle. But a parent who took care of their, a father who took care of his children for that reason would be some kind of maniac, right? Would be a morally revolting character. So that shows that the moral objection to taking care of your children isn't derived from the same basis as your moral obligations to your friends whom you drive out into the desert, right? That's a different thing. And so pluralism of that kind between what we owe to each other and what's worth doing in life, in the case of talents, pluralism between what we owe to strangers and how we ought to feel about our children. Those are different subjects, as it were. They're different. And so you might think that when I discovered that contractualism didn't actually explain either of these things, I should have taken that as a refutation of contractualism, right? But I had the nerve, somebody might say the chutzpah or whatever, to say that this isn't a refutation, it's a discovery. I found that morality is pluralistic, right? Now that might seem question begging. Why is it not question begging? Well, it's not question begging because the motivational basis for these things seems quite different. It's not just that the content is different, but the reason why I should care about developing my talents just because they're worthwhile is a different. The reasons I have to care about that are different than the reasons I have to care about how I treat, whether I treat other people on principles they could reasonably reject. And similarly with my children, I should love my children. I shouldn't treat them on the basis of the same basis that I treat. And so what I've discovered there is a kind of pluralism about, as it were, the ultimate normative bases of these ways of thinking, right? Okay. But if we shift to the kind of pluralism that Parfit was suggesting there, I don't think we find a kind of pluralism in the underlying basis. There's one way of accounting for aggregation, which is pluralistic in that way. That is, this was suggested by Elizabeth Anscombe a long time ago, although she didn't have contractualism in mind, obviously. Contractualism is a view she would hate. And suggested more recently by Veronique Munoz-Dardet and some other people. But you might say, if I have to choose between saving a larger and a smaller number of people, then a person in neither group could reasonably reject a principle that permitted me to save the others, because their reasons for rejecting the principles are totally equivalent, right? So the conclusion is it wouldn't be wrong for me to save the larger group, and it wouldn't be wrong for me to save the smaller group, right? So then the answer is, well, even though it wouldn't be wrong for me to save the larger group, given that it wouldn't be wrong for me to save the larger group, it would be better to save the larger group, right? So there's a kind of pluralism between how can I behave in a way that doesn't wrong any individual, and what do I have most reason to do, right? So that would be a kind of pluralism which would be like the previous kind of pluralism. But I took it that Parfit and my wonderful former student, Johann Frick, whom I also quote in this paper. He's one of the best younger moral philosophers going. The kind of pluralism they suggest, I think, isn't more of this and that kind. It tries to bring within contractualism different ways of reasoning, right? So I think that would be to see that contractualism itself has a multiplicity of kind of arguments within it, right? And I'm inclined to think that I'm not sure what to say about their arguments, right? I'm inclined to think that I should probably accept Frick's view in Contractualism and Social Risk. I don't know if you know that paper, but it's a really great paper. As to aggregation in general, I think the the way of dealing with aggregation that I tentatively suggest in that paper is a way of, not a kind of pluralism, but it's a way of modifying contractualism to be more accommodating. That's to say, it seemed to me that the only reasons for rejecting a principle had to be reasons that individuals have, because morality, as contractually described, is about what we owe to them. And so it's about their objections. So it would be a big departure to bring in objections to principles based on aggregate effects, right? But we might say, even though it wouldn't be wrong to save the larger number, whatever, because nobody could reject it, nonetheless, it wouldn't be reasonable for someone in the smaller group to reject a principle requiring me to save the larger number, because that'd be a very good thing. And he would be failing to see that it would be a good thing. So maybe aggregative considerations aren't a basis for rejecting principles. They don't make them wrong, but they are considerations that can make rejection unreasonable. I'm not sure whether that's right, but that was what I tried out in that paper, Contractualism and Justification. I don't know if you could tell from reading that paper, but it was a very painful paper to write because I was trying to wrestle with questions about whether this view was really right or not. And it's very hard to look at your own view in that way and try to think clearly about what was wrong about it. So I'm still not sure what to say about that. But going back to what I said in an earlier question about reductivism, I want to say, well, maybe contractualism, according to contractualism, things are wrong because of the reasons that people have for rejecting it, not because of the badness of consequences. But the reasonableness of rejecting a principle it could be unreasonable to reject a principle, not because of the badness of the consequences, but simply because so many other people had reasons to object. I don't know. I'm taking individuals' reasons as the bulwark. That might be a way to go. But the question, the confession I have to you is that I'm still unsure how to deal with the question of aggregation. Everybody growing up in the United States has to read, at least if you go through high school, and certainly if you go to university, you have to read this very, very, very long novel by Herman Melville called Moby Dick. I don't know if any of you have had to read this, but it's an enormously long book about some men on a ship that's chasing whales, the very large mammals who live in the sea, right? And Captain Ahab, the captain of the ship, is kind of crazy because he lost his leg to a white whale, which is a very unusual thing, Moby Dick. And so he's risking the lives of all the crew on his crazy quest to find and kill the white whale. So the problem of aggregation is my intellectual white whale, right? I'm sailing through life in the eternal quest to try to capture and subdue the white whale of aggregation, but I haven't managed to do it. But speaking of Melville, I want to recommend another thing by Melville. I recently did a podcast with a philosopher at my neighboring institution, MIT, named Kiran Setia. I don't know if you've ever seen. He has a podcast called 5 Questions. Setia, Setiya. I don't know where his name comes from. I don't think it's Russian, but who knows? It would be, you could spell it in Russian with fewer letters, right? Just using a soft ya at the end. Anyway, and one question he asks you is to mention a work of literature that you think is philosophically interesting. And the work that I chose was a short story by the same writer, Herman Melville. It's called Bartleby the Scrivener, which is about a man whose job is copying. This is in the 1800s. People had to hours copying out legal documents, and so I think this is a very interesting story. It's an interesting story because it's a story about, one way of understanding, it's a story about the failure of moral communication. All Bartleby will say when anybody asks him to do something is, "I'd prefer not." He won't give any reasons. He just says, "I prefer not," right? And so there's a complete breakdown in moral communication. And so the way a contractualist reads this is a vindication of contractualism as compared to utilitarianism based on preferences. This shows you, right? Preferences are not a workable basis for moral communication. You need to give reasons, right? But there are other ways of as I say in my response in this podcast, which you can find, there are other ways of understanding the story. A kind of Marxist understanding, according to which Bartleby sees that to start giving reasons to the lawyer who runs the business, he would be simply being absorbed into the capitalist order, because the only reasons that would count would be reasons that are defined by this crushing system, right? So it shows you that even if moral justification of the kind that contractualism describes is a human good, even if it's something we have reason to want, there are some social circumstances under which it's unattainable, and attempts to attain it will lead to bad results. And the other alternative is a sort of Nietzsche's alternative, that the whole idea of being able to justify yourself to other people is a kind of weakness. And so Bartleby is a tower of strength. Anyhow, I think these are three different readings of this story, which are interesting because they bring out these different ways of thinking about moral communication. And those different ways of thinking about moral communication are important because they show you that if you want to defend one of these views, that moral communication is an important good, or that moral communication, if you want to defend that, then you have to respond to the challenge that's raised by these other views, namely that moral communication may be good, but in some social circumstances it's unattainable, or as the Nietzsche would say, it's not really a good at all, right? So it brings out the fact that if you want to defend the goodness of being able to justify yourself to others, you've got to take on the burden of answering the Marxist and the Nietzschean challenge. But anyway, that's my. You don't need to watch the podcast now because I repeated myself. But anyways, I thought you would find it amusing, and it's a great story. It's also in English. It's also always in the same volume as another short story of Melville's, called Benito Sereno, which is a story about a slave rebellion, which is totally depressing and frightening. But they're both. Melville was a great writer, anyhow. So that's my English literature lesson for you for today. I beg your pardon for going off script.
No, thank you so much. It was a very interesting digression, and I share your position regarding Melville, because I think he's indeed a very philosophical author, and a very underrated one, at least in Russia or in post-Soviet countries. So I agree, of course. And I also think that your attempts to revise and improve contractualism and in this paper is quite compelling, theoretically and intuitively, at least to me personally. So I'm very excited to see where this revision or this whole process is going, and how contractualism will look in the next decades. So thank you again.
Well, I'm encouraged that you think that. I'm encouraged that you think that, and I will try to think of you as my Starbuck. If I die in the quest for the white whale, you can carry on, having floated to safety on Queequeg's coffin.
Yeah, it will be nice, I think. Yeah, and thank you again. And now I give floor to Alexei for the last round of short questions.
Yeah, it is exactly again about the classical stuff, classical literature. And I have to say that classical literature in Russian is quite depressive as well. So it is not so scary for us, you know, to read some depressive literature in English. So, yeah. So this is our short and quick round of questions. And the first one is, who would you call the classical philosopher par excellence?
Well, in English, as you probably know, classical philosopher generally means philosopher from the Greek and Roman period. And there's no doubt that from that period, my hero is Socrates, especially as shown in the dialogue Gorgias, which seems to me a monument of philosophical inquiry. I can explain why. But anyway, I think what I'm doing is trying to do what I think Socrates was doing back then.
And if it is, you know, in Russian, we have this connection between classical and Greek. So, I mean, ancient Greek classical authors. But if we are talking about, you know, the most influential classical, like the person who you can read and find new and new stuff every time, if we will not speak about Greek or Roman world, who would you call the most important one?
Well, for not thinking about the Greek and Roman world, I see, just in the whole tradition of philosophy. Well, that really gets into, I mean, I might just the philosopher par excellence, that is somebody who most purely illustrates the philosophical outlook. You know, Socrates still might be my nominee, even if we take all the ensuings centuries. I can't think of a clearer case. I mean, if I jump forward in answering your second question, who's my favorite philosopher? Well, it might be Socrates, Mill, Sidgwick, even though I disagree with them. Recently, because I've been working on trying to revisit some ideas about the idea of something being good. I've been trying to revisit my things about that. And that led me to be working again on Sidgwick's book, The Methods of Ethics. It's the greatest statement of utilitarianism, right? And I'm not a utilitarian. But I have to say that reading it carefully over and over again, I'm more and more impressed with Sidgwick's care and his attempt to be self-critical and as a philosopher. It's very moving. So even though I disagree with him, I think he's a great example of somebody doing what I would try to do. I mean, I wouldn't talk about my contemporaries. I feel enormously lucky to have been born into a generation in philosophy in my country, where there were an enormous number here in Britain. Those are the ones, enormous number of extraordinarily talented people. So I don't want to try to rate my contemporaries, but there are a lot of very good ones. I've mentioned some of them already.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And the third question is, what would you call the most important philosophical issue or issues for the next decade?
Well, I think it's important to separate the importance of certain questions from the need for a philosophical analysis of them. I mean, climate change is a terribly important and pressing question, and a lot of people seem to think, therefore, philosophers ought to be writing about it. But I'm not so convinced of that, because philosophers write about things. Philosophers have something to contribute to issues that are puzzling. So if philosophers start writing about climate change, they're going to write about the aspects of it that are puzzling, like what do we owe to future generations, and Parfit's puzzles about the mere addition paradox, and the non-identity problem, and so on. And it strikes me as not necessarily a good thing to be introducing the appearance of uncertainty into what's an obvious issue. Climate change is a terribly pressing issue. It's absolutely crucial that we do something about it now. And exactly how we should think about it, it's not something that we primarily owe to the most distant people. There are already people alive now whose lives are going to be terribly impacted by climate change if we don't do what we're doing. So I think it's making the whole subject more controversial than it really is if we start investigating the thing. So I think that to treat it as a philosophical issue isn't such a good thing. On the other hand, inequality, I just wrote a book about inequality. And I think inequality is a philosophical issue because there are puzzles about why is inequality bad rather than just poverty being bad. Why does the difference between what one person has and another person has matter, as opposed to it simply being important that the people who have less should have more, or what Parfit calls prioritarianism. And I think that's an important question. It's a question partly because if we think differently about inequality, we would address it in different ways, right? So I think that there are many different objections to inequality, which lead to different policy avenues that we ought to be addressing. So there's a case where trying to get clearer about exactly what's wrong, when is inequality the problem, and what's problematic about it, as opposed to simply saying, well, how can we make the worst off better off? I think we should be making the worst off better off, but there are cases where inequality matters too. So there's a philosophical question, and I think it's going to become more and more pressing as inequality has already increased enormously. There were already objectionable levels of inequality back in the 1940s and 50s, but it's just gotten worse and worse, right? And it's going to continue to get worse. So there's a question where there's really important philosophical problems. I also think that questions of individual responsibility are, what are individuals responsible for? Basically problems of free will and so on. I think that those are deeply philosophical problems that have important public implications. And I have my own views about those, but I think that there's a lot of uncertainty about that, and people's mistaken views about responsibility have very bad policy implications. So I think that there's a philosophical question that's going to be more important, and no doubt there are others, but I just mainly wanted to distinguish between the importance of a problem. So to take the COVID-19 pandemic, it's very distressing how people have thought about it. I think they're obvious. Here's an obvious moral principle. Have we run out of time, or should I keep talking?
Well, it is up to you. It is really
okay. I'll keep talking. Okay, so here's a moral principle. I'll engage in intuitive moral thinking, right? Not applying contractualism, but then I'll bring contractualism in. So, if there's some very serious threat that we all face, which can only be alleviated by our all acting together in some way, and if some plan of acting together has been proposed, and a fair number of people are going along with it, then it would be, and it's not unfair, then it would be wrong for me not to go along with it. That seems to be an obvious principle, right? And that's a principle that has a home. You could try to derive it from Kant's categorical imperative, from Hume's discussion in his essay on morals, and the analogy of the wall and the arch, called artificial virtues. It's Rawls's principle of fairness or natural duty of justice. All of those would apply to this. And what I call in the last chapter of my book, the principle of established practices, is a contractualist way of responding to this. Okay. Now, I think that it's a kind of tragedy in my country that a lot of people, there's been a divide between people for whom that is an obvious moral principle. So they think, of course I'm going to wear a mask because it's a trivial thing to get a mask. It's not unfair to ask me to wear a mask, right? It's a collective action. It's going to make us all safer. So it's a kind of no-brainer. Whereas there are other people who don't seem to be taking this principle on board. So there's a case of a kind of moral divide, and I think it's important. I don't know whether philosophy can help persuade other people to do this. It's also an example, I think, of how philosophy can be useful in the discussion in the United States on issues not simply with mask wearing, but so-called shutdowns, or people staying home and so on. People in the American press, that's commonly discussed as a trade-off between two different values: the value of public safety by controlling the epidemic versus the value of the economy. People making more money, their jobs, the economy expanding and not having unemployment. It seems to follow from the principle that I stated that that's not the right way to look at it, right? I said that if there's a form of collective action which deals with the problem and it's established and it's not unfair, then I ought to go along with it. So if we suppose the problem is that we live in a low-lying area and the river is rising and all of our homes are going to be swept away unless we build up piles of sandbags to keep the river back, right? Now, if we have a system for doing that, it would be wrong not to go along with it. But suppose it only imposes a burden on people whose normal jobs involve heavy lifting, and they aren't compensated. They're just told, okay, if you're strong and have a job involving heavy lifting, you got to go build up the sandbags, right? That would be unfair, right? So in order for it not to be objectionable, to have to go along with the principle has to be unfair. So moving to COVID, people like me who are retired and have income that I don't have to go to the office to earn, if I have to stay home, it doesn't impose any cost on me at all, right? But people who have to go to work to earn money, it imposes a big cost on them. Or people who own a restaurant and they lose their business, it imposes a high cost on them, right? So the principle, in order for the principle to be binding, there has to be a redistribution as part of the principle itself, right? Not as something we do later to stimulate the economy after it's over, right? So it's a precondition, right? So trying to formulate it as an abstract principle brings out a question of what needs to be answered up front in order to explain the bindingness of the principle. So anyway, so there's a plea for how philosophical thinking can look. So I think it's unreasonable for people to object to being asked to wear masks, but it's not unreasonable for them to object to a policy that deprives them of their job without giving them any compensating unemployment insurance, right? And so there's a case of a useful bit of philosophy, it seems to me. That's probably I'm sure these are things that all of you knew already, but I'm just reminding you of what you knew already.
But I mean, that's really interesting, and I mean, it is interesting not only in the context of the United States, but in the context of our country as well. And I mean, it's great. And by the way, while we were preparing to this conversation, we had one seminar on the questions connected with the climate change and ecology and contractual theory and how it can be used in this field. So, I mean, maybe we were not so convinced, at what degree is this really a contractualist way of thinking, but again, it could be useful to look through these questions with the framework of contractual theory. And so then the last short and quick question is about the online resources, from university encyclopedias to YouTube channels you would advise to follow for those interested in philosophy.
Yes, well, as I said in my written thing, the most useful online thing I find, in addition to consulting individual people's websites, I'm a bad person because I've been too disorganized to create a website. But the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is seems to be extremely useful. I also find what I mentioned in my email, the Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews. You can just Google NDPR. It's very good reviews of contemporary books. They just underwent a change of editorship, so they're not posting many new ones right now. But their archive is very good, going back quite a way, and that's very good. There was a period a number of years ago when I used to visit various philosophy blogs where there was online conversation. I find myself not doing that so much anymore, although I do think that the one that survived from that period called Pea Soup, PEA, like the vegetable, pea soup, does often have good discussions, and it varies from moment to moment, but that's something worth checking on. And there are also things like Social Science Research Network, which is more social science and philosophy, and academia.edu, I do have some of my papers on that, but I'm just too lazy to have a website. But those are the main ones that come to mind. There is an increasing number of people who are putting on podcasts, and I've been asked to do a number of different interviews. Like I said, there's at the EHESS in Paris, École des Hautes Études des Sciences Sociales. I did some interviews with them, and they have interviews with lots of different people. So there are lots of things like that, like Kieran Setia's 5 Questions, which has lots of good interviews. There's a very good one with my colleague Tommy Shelby, who writes on race, and with lots of other people too. But I just happen to listen to Tommy's.
Yeah, cool. Because we have a page on on our project webpage with these helpful resources, and you give us a lot to add to this to this page. It's really nice. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your kind attitude, and it was really interesting and thought-provoking conversation. It is so nice to see you and to hear you in person. Thank you so much, Scanlon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you all very much. As I said, I'm gratified that you're interested. I admire the depth of your understanding, and I wish you well.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye to all.